seagrass beds underneath to be able to hunt and provide their families with turtle meat, and particularly for ceremonial occasions. But this leads to some of these really overlooked things that museums often don't display, or if they do display, they're like this. They're in a position of, here's a lot of things. We don't know a lot about each one of them. They are so slender and difficult to display. We will give you a map in order for you to be able to understand. This photograph comes from research with Robert Torrance and others in the McGregor project, which I talked about last Pacific Art Society forum. But was part of the work to try and find out where 13,000 objects that McGregor acquired for the people of Papua New Guinea in the 1880s and 1890s, and where they went. So this is the British Museum. This bundle of arrows had not been opened possibly since it arrived in the 1900s in the British Museum. And it is part of a difficulty. It is part of a difficulty of history. So these were part of warfare. They are part of a shared story between Europeans and Torres Strait Islanders and Kiwi Papuans of that same coast where that other image was from, about a series of wars that happened with the Marinda Min people, then called the Tigere, of Western Province, who had long come across the border for both trade and also for traditional warfare, as you might call it. And because of a colonial structure where peace was required in order to give prosperity, McGregor spent a great deal of time along that coast working with people from Kiwi, Wegu, Saibai and Tuam to try and work out how they can deter the Tigere. He also tried diplomacy with the Dutch, which didn't get very far. And so in 1896 there was a final battle, as he called it, in which hundreds of arrows were acquired. Some of them, like these, basic weapons of war. So things that were flung and with the intention of hitting their target, but not expected to be reclaimed again. They went to the British Museum, to Museum Victoria, to Queensland Museum, to the Australian Museum, and probably from there to some other museums as well, to Aberdeen University. And here they largely sit, unworked upon, unlooked at, not valued, and not seen, because they are really troublesome things. They are images of a war that was a great entanglement from a colonial situation, and which requires a lot of unpacking and work with people across 3 different nations, along with all of those different museum partners, to be able to really work through. The picture on the far right is some of those arrows in Queensland Museum. The middle one is a series of arrows in Aberdeen, and the one on the left is from an earlier expedition which also had warfare, encountered warfare because of these incursions between Tigere and people of the Western Province. When D'Albertus and Bakari were travelling in West Papua and New Guinea, D'Albertus travelled up the Fly River and talks constantly about having arrows fired at him, and one assumes that many of those arrows that were fired at him and his boat were then collected as part of his collection. They're one of the few, in Italy and Florence, they're one of the few places that actually exhibits them, but again, you exhibit it as a mess. There's a whole vitrine, they are filled with arrows. You're encouraged to see this as a thing. But each of these would not be carried as a huge bundle. People would carry bundles, they would trade bundles with people like McGregor and D'Albertus. And it is this aspect that I want to think about in terms of what happens in a more 20th century view. So one of the big collections that we are constantly offered in every museum that I know of are small bundles of arrows. I have one at home. They are given to people as gifts, particularly when you're working in places like Papua New Guinea, as part of a relationship, as part of a, we want you to remember us, a parting gift. So there are another group, a huge group of arrows that are now in museums, from patrol officers, from people like yourself, from people like myself, which have come in as small relationships, each one to a particular village and a particular group of people. We don't exhibit these either. What do we do with these hundreds of thousands of arrows from across the Pacific and spears? How do we actually engage and work with them? We heard, Tricia and I were privileged yesterday to be talking with Sana Vilai up in Queensland, and she was talking about a return of a particular puka spear, and another from New Britain, which had a relationship with human remains, and its return, an actual refusal of return of another similar, because of the issues that that object brought to the people. And this is the situation for those arrows in the middle. These are difficult, troublesome objects. These are objects that still carry with them parts of people, the blood and the hair of individuals that are bound into them to propel them and to make them strong, and the symbolic patterns and the words that went with them that made them actually work, if you like to use that word. So these are, again, those sorts of things which have been heralded in connoisseurship for hundreds of years. From D'Albertus onwards, people have individually looked at each one and gone, well, this must come from here because it's got this pattern, and this one must come from here because it's this pattern, and this shows that this people have this particular. It gets you a good way in understanding that these arrows exist in this part of the world. It gets you nowhere to understand how they were used in the past and how we should respect them and think about working with people to understand how to use and see them in the future. Should they be returned? Should they be quietly away where no one can see them? These are all questions that we have to continue to work with. In Tidal Kin, the exhibition with 8 stories, we started with the Gadigal people. That exhibition was also supposed to have 3 fine spears at the front. Spears made by a senior elder of the Gadigal Nation today, Uncle Rod Mason, and due to their own growing work, thanks to the repatriation of 4 1770s spears that were appropriated by the Endeavour expedition. You will have seen, and if you haven't seen, just look up Google spears online, you'll see a massive information. When Trinity College recognised after 10 years of work by the Gujaga and Lapuris local Aboriginal Land Council that these should be returned. It was work that involved the British Museum, Museum Victoria, senior academics in ANU, and exhibitions between British Museum and the National Museum of Australia called the Encounters Project, which you probably saw. And it led to 4 journeys of those spears back and forth between Australia and Cambridge, back and forth. Each time was an opportunity to increase the political work to have those repatriated to their own country. But it took those 4 journeys back and forth, to have those conversations to ensure that that was met, in part because in Australia we have something called the Peacock Agreement, where directors are led to assure overseas lenders that there will be no claim for repatriation on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander objects that travel to Australia. So it is not possible for Lapuris Local Aboriginal Land Council to put in a repatriation request for those spears when they were here in Australia. They must wait for them to go back, and then they can. And then there are negotiations, which took Cambridge University museums, British Museum and National Museum, along with other academics, a long time, working closely and from the instructions of the Gujaga Foundation and Libraries like the Aboriginal Land Council to ensure that this pathway was correct. And finally, Trinity said yes. So we had the privilege of having those spears here in 2022 when they came out with one of these visits. It was the first time they had been back to their own country. And we actually acted as a venue with that. We were not part of the negotiations and the moves, but we were able to be a venue for them to be seen on their own land. And so it is a common aspect of much of our work that you must step back. You do not step forward to take control. You need to step back to allow other people to take that control. And we, from there, had negotiated with Gujaga to have 4 new spears made as part of a relationship, a sort of long-term relationship and respect for them and their work. And with the return of the repatriation of those 4 spears, finally, Gujaga Foundation said, well, actually, because we now have funding for our cultural centre, we want to make sure those 4 spears are here with us, because he is a senior elder. His knowledge is, going to be passed on, and it needs to be passed on through us, with us. So instead of having 4 spears, we are instead dominated with the image that Tupaya made in 1770, the great priest from Greater. And he, if you look at that picture, a technique that he only learnt on the endeavour of drawing with pencil and paper, you see the enormous detail that he gives to both the fish that is being caught and the detail of that spear and the canoe. That these are things that he was really closely looking at. So the absence of those 3 new spears is instead carried with the words and the spoken words of Kirsty, his last name's gone out of my head, who is a Gadigal woman who works at Gujaga, who talks of the taking of these spears and the continuation of their culture and the practice of making spears into the future. We are continuing to work with Gujaga on how we can manage the collections here through Marika Duchinsky, and how we can assist them going forward with the making of their own cultural centre on Sydney. It's part of a continued conversation that we have about return. It is not always return that is involving the collections that we hold ourselves. This was one of the first times that I was privileged to be part of this kind of return work, and I pay my respects to the now recently passed Professor Grant McCall, who worked for a long time in Rapa Nui with Rapa Nui peoples, but also on the concept of islands in an academic framework which he termed missiology, small island life. So in a brief period in the 2000s, when I was working at the Australian Museum, one of their corridor displays was able to be used for a small exhibition about the photographs from Reverend George Brown and some of the Samoan objects that were there. We worked with a woman from the National Museum of Samoa to ensure that the text was bilingual and to ensure that the photographs that were selected for that were appropriate. And it seemed crazy that, having had this work and this small exhibition in Sydney, that this could not be also given back to Samoa so that they could use it. They wrote the text, all they needed was the images. So we just worked under the radar, if you like, with archives and other members of the cultural collections team then to print out a selection of works, to frame them up, and you know those big carry-all bags with the stripes, and they're very cheap, you buy them in every market. We managed to fit, I think it was 14, 7 in one bag, 7 in the next bag, and Grant McCall was, every year he went on to a different island with a number of students in the Pacific Island Field School run through ANU. And he was going to Samoa. So hey, opportunity, dashed out to the airport as they were leaving, gave Grant the days, he gave them to the National Museum of Samoa, and then they travelled around Samoa for however long before the materials suffered from the climate of a humid place. But it was a way to be able to give back, but you don't need to be the central actor. It is a way to be able to give back where you are just providing the material for someone else to do the work that they do in their own country with their own heritage. And I have, this was a project that was only possible because of Andrew Motu and the then head of the trustees, sorry, names have gone completely out of my head. And it was Mr. Kaleni, who was an agricultural worker. He was going to come to Sydney from Hungary after the war, but the boat stopped at Port Moresby and he thought, oh, this looks good, and he got off. And he stayed in Papua New Guinea as a worker within the colonial government from 1947 to independence, when he came out to Australia with around 200 objects. He was part of the initial phase of the Oceanic Art Society, where people would meet and discuss and talk about and swap things and look at and enjoy and share their memories of work and life in places like Papua New Guinea, and the styles and materials and the absolute finesse of their cultural materials. He was, as you can see, quite an old man when we saw him. He was in his mid-90s, and he's here with the Minister, Minister Onu Kona, who came out thanks to the National Museum of Papua New Guinea and the trustees, who paid for, the trustees individually paid for the freight of the collection to go home. So it was a collection of things which are often sort of thought of as tourist works. It contained things that were also thought of as fine materials by recognised carvers and artists from across Papua New Guinea. And to be able to do this, again, it was an under-the-radar project. We worked with Sydney University's Museum Studies volunteers to catalogue everything. And we had a small amount of money to be able to warehouse it briefly, to be able to make sure that it was pest-free on return to Papua New Guinea, because you don't want to be giving people problems when you give people collections. And it was quite an exhausting journey, but it was a real privilege to be part of this work to ensure that material that was once considered low-grade tourist works, which had predominantly left Papua New Guinea with various people who were working as patrol officers and members of the administration, and who had collected and received gifts, and they all came back to Australia, or they all came back to the various countries. And so they're part of those things that left but didn't get put into the National Museum. So this was an opportunity to be able to record 30 years of cultural material for the National Museum of Papua New Guinea that wasn't otherwise represented there. And some of his works are now on display in their new gallery that went up in 2010. This was another project from this year. As you can see from the labels, we moved to Tahiti. It was an outcome of Tidal King. So exhibitions, as I briefly mentioned at the beginning, are a really important way to advertise, in part, what is here in the museum. It's part of the reason the ambassadors are centred on the 7 regions that you see them, because it's telling people we have your cultural works here if you are from Camden area, if you are from Rainforest, Queensland, and so on. These are areas that this museum has things from. So Chau Chak Wing did some of that work, and during part of the sort of public programs of the exhibition, there was a big forum that Denita from the Townhouse Museum organised to take place in this museum, part of a Talanoa that was connected to Yuki Kahara's Paradise exhibition at that time. And we had just been asked by the owners of this material, a church in Ryde, one of the oldest churches in Sydney, and a private descendant of the Henry family, who were London Missionary Society missionaries in Tahiti from the 1820s. We were asked whether we could help, whether A, we wanted the material. We looked at it and we went, this should go to Tahiti. It shouldn't come to us. This is an account, never published, of the Tahitian civil wars that came up following the various voyages that were kept on, bringing in new ideas and things and taking people out, and epidemics and other kinds of aspects involved as the fallout of exploration. And this was an account of these wars. It was also an account of their history and relationships and observations as the Henry family slowly learned from and understood Tahitians. It included Tahitian Bible, one of those first editions, which was a collaborative project between Tahitian converts and the mission. And it included some descendant of the Henry family who had travelled from Sydney to Tahiti to see her distant cousins who had grown up in Tahiti as Tahitians, and her sort of engagement with them. It had already been digitised thanks to the work of the Pacific Manuscripts Bureau, which is just an unbelievable resource to go everywhere, and thanks to the ways that computerisation is happening, it is increasingly easy to get access to those resources and materials. And so when we were at the Yuki Kahara's Talanoa here at the museum, the director of the National Museum of Tahiti was visiting as part of that Talanoa. She was one of the speakers. So we've just been asked, can we take it? We said, no, we don't. We think it should go back. The donors agreed. And so I had an opportunity to ask her directly, is this something you want us to pursue? Would you like it back? Is it meant to go back? They had already been asked this question when the Manuscripts Bureau had digitised it, but things fell through in Canberra, and so this was sort of a longer project. And it's an example of how museums can work as mechanisms, as using the ways that we have inherited to look after objects within a single area. So those include quarantining to ensure the bugs don't carry, itemisation and photography, measurement and documentation, as well as legal aspects. So this could not be our collection, and it no longer wanted to be part of Ryde and the Descendants collection, but it was not yet in Tahiti. But Marie Cluttenbach, our collection manager, said what we can do is ensure through the documentation process that Tahiti can take legal ownership of the material. So she organised the documents to go back around all those 3 different organisations. And we will loan it from Tahiti in order for it to go through quarantine and be packaged up ready. We then waited for the Gauguin exhibition to open, because like Ground and Call, this was an opportunity to take up that other issue of any of this work, which is cost. So the current director of the Tahiti Museum was going to be here as part of the symposium of the Gauguin opening. She travelled up to Sydney, she got everything, put it in her bag. We realised that the box that all of these were put in, an old packing case that belonged to the Henry family, it was a little bit too big for her luggage, so that ended up in the post. And then just last week I got the email that said, we received the box, it's all here, it's all good. We're just waiting to, ensure that it's all safe, and we will start to work with it. Thanks to the Pacific Island Manuscript Bureau, they already have a digitised version of everything. So it is something that can almost immediately be used by Tahitians and Tahitian researchers. So finally, I just wanted to return to Grant McCall, who we were contacted in, I think it was March this year, by a PhD student working in Rapa Nui who had met Grant. Grant had showed him the collections that he had, which also included a very important genealogy document. And he had talked with Rapa Nui community members and the Council of Families, and there was interest in knowing whether they could take back materials that were in this collection. It is after the 50 years that Grant has been going back and forwards to Rapa Nui, the collections that he has are large, I guess, packing boxes from here to here and back. They had fortunately all been labelled by the family, so there were artefact boxes, there were book boxes, there were print boxes, there were toys, other things from his offices. So we have had a 30-year project with the Hong Kong Baptist University, who sent us 2 wonderful interns every single year to learn about anything that we care to give them and take on these amazing challenges. And so we went to visit Grant's widow, Julia, and to start to work through these boxes and boxes. Now, there are a lot of things in his collection that relate back to this idea of tourism. This is not one of them. This is one of 2 necklaces that were carved by a now greatly respected carver who's passed away, that were given as parting gifts to Grant and his partner on their leaving their first field work. So these are parts of these things that really need to go back again now that it's a return gift, if you like, of that nature. It also includes what must be over 100 of these kinds of shell necklaces, often thought of as tourism sort of gifts, but each of them is finely made, really beautifully immaculate collection of shells and sizes and the weaving that goes into it, and is something that is harder and harder to make today. These are gifts given as in honour of someone who's come, but today generally it's more usual from Julia McCall's recollection to give wreaths of flowers and even plastic glaze, because shells are now a very restricted item and cannot be given out in these hundreds and hundreds to passers-by and others. So with that means there's less making of these and the ways that they're made in these particular rosettes and the styles that they have. And Grant obviously was interested in part of this because the one on the far left is actually Kiribati, and it's something that he's purchased, but it shows this really fine work and the relationship of these peoples and cultural ways of expressing friendship and honour. So we'll wait and see. We're just doing the documentation. That documentation is going back to Carlos and the Council of Families. In September, he'll bring out a cultural worker with him to look through the collection and to work out what should go back to Rapa Nui. They're in a colonial situation, so this is not a formal issue of a national museum to national institution. This is to the Council of Families, who work in partnership with the National Museum, which is owned by Chile. So it needs to take account of those political issues that can exist in many different countries in order to be able to return safely. But in his collection, as well as these beautiful shell works, are an enormous number of statue forms of the great carving of ancestors that Rapa Nui is so famous for. Some of these too will be made by carvers who are recognised today in Rapa Nui for their excellence and their importance. And some of them, the most bizarre, would be a tissue holder made of plastic with the tissues coming from the nose. So what he has documented, because he acquired these everywhere, is part of a European fascination and part of a corruption, if you like, of really important aspects that have inspired wonder and awe, and even the very large have travelled all the way to the British Museum where they still stand today, but which have become through tourism and film and popular culture a very different kind of disrespectful, and as our laughter, you can't help but laugh at these things, they're quite bizarre. There's a foam one, there's a tissue box, there's ones made of foam, there's a cushion one, it's just incredible the ways that people have conceived to make humour from these really important ancestral people. So in closing, I want to think about this idea between tourism and the real thing, and the different ways that we need to think about how tourism reflects ourselves and our museum communities and travellers, and the sorts of things that we acquire through that process, how we assist and don't assist the continuation of traditions through paying money to artists who are working hard to make these things for their communities. They're not categories that are often thought of, tourism, as part of museum work, but I would argue that for some of these representations, probably not these three, but other representations of these ancestors, an institution like the Powerhouse that collects also aspects of contemporary culture. Well, aspects of contemporary culture it does.
Yeah, I know, but they're hopeless. Anyway, sorry, go on.
That can allow us to reflect on our practices as international communities and the ways that we think of and pick up things in different ways. And in closing, I also want to reflect on redundancy, like the arrows and like the statue after statue or the shell after shell, that these thousands and thousands of samenesses are also, from research points of view, needed to understand the individual, the particular and the purposeful, and those relationships that are embedded in all of these things in order to both get back to a relationship with those communities, to understand better how to work with and ensure the prosperity of the collections